bass.
Welcome to another edition of Truth and Rhythm. This is the interview show that gets deep in the pocket with contemporary music's foremost masters of the groove. I am your host, Scott Dr. GX Goldfine. If you enjoy this programming, subscribe to the Funk and Stuff channel on YouTube, which is where Truth and Rhythm lives, and be an advocate by spreading the word among fellow funk, jazz, and R&B music lovers. Join Truth and Rhythm's membership program through Patreon. You can also submit a direct donation to the cause anytime at funkandstuff.net. At that site, you can also purchase the book Everything's on the One, The First Guide of Funk. Shop for official Truth and Rhythm and Funk and Stuff merchandise, and use the Amazon links for all of your online purchases, which allocates a percentage to this show. For those of you who go the extra step in supporting the show, you have my heartfelt gratitude for allowing us to continue to shine the light on those special artists whose quest is to find truth in rhythm. I am pleased to welcome to the Truth and Rhythm Mothership drummer Dave Watts, composer, arranger, and founder of Boulder, Colorado's funky musical collective, the Motet. Also incorporating soul, jazz, world, and folk music, definitely funk too, into its sound. Since 2002, the group has released 9 studio albums, been a fixture on the festival circuit, and consistently lit up stages with super grooving sets and dazzling musicality. The band's latest album, All Day, was just released earlier this year. Dave, thank you for coming. How are you?
Pretty good, Scott. Thanks for having me, man.
A pleasure. So You're just back from a gig. I know you're catching up on some rest, but where are you today? Where are you?
I'm in Boulder, at my house in Boulder. Just got a few days off before the next run. We're heading up into the mountains this coming weekend, so trying to catch up on stuff in between. Gets a little schizophrenic going out every weekend, but I try and squeeze stuff in between tours.
You guys are such road warriors for so long now. It must have been very strange during the pandemic.
Yeah, I mean, it was great. I loved it. It was a very bizarre experience. That first week of where the gigs started dropping off, and we were like, oh, okay, I guess we got the weekend off, and then it was like, oh, I guess we got 2 weeks off, and it just kept coming, and pretty soon it was like, wow, 6 months off, man, what's that going to be like? But it's, musicians, we always find a way to keep ourselves busy. We don't need gigs to necessarily find ways to be creative. We're at home. I think a lot of people got their home recording setups dialed in. I know that I did, and spent a lot of time, people were learning how to use Zoom and video and that sort of thing. So, I filled my time pretty easily not touring. We were just talking about how, man, touring, we spend so much time just in an airport or in the hotel lobby, traveling, driving, so much time not playing music, and then you do a gig, and sometimes a gig might be an opener and you're playing for an hour or something, but you just, you realize you did 3 days of travel for an hour's worth of music. So when I'm at home, during the pandemic, I played more music than I do normally, just because I was getting behind my kid every day and shedding and writing tunes and working on how to figure out my, the recording setup and video setup. So I found myself even more busy making music when the pandemic hit.
That's one thing I theorized. Once it started extending itself, I was always thinking, I bet we're going to get some awesome music coming out of it. Everyone's hunkered down, and the restless energy, and
it seemed like it went one way or the other. some bands were like, putting out all this content, and other bands were like taking vacations. Because that's kind of like, you can get your head together, by not playing music and actually come up with a lot of creative ideas when you step away for a minute. But I always just, I always feel that way when I'm overwhelmed with music, and I'm like, oh, I just need to step away. And then, a day or so into that, I'm just like, damn, I want to play. You know what I mean? It just calls me back. And then I find just like the ideas circulate in my head, and I'm just like called back to my home studio or whatever it is I'm working on. And, it's just, it's kind of an obsession. It's a little OCD, but that's what keeps us, creative.
I'm guessing though, when you got back to it though, and got back on stage, that felt pretty darn good.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, the first gigs were weird, because we play dance music, and there was all these sit down shows and like people in their little pods. Even some of these shows where people weren't allowed to dance, like as if like dancing made COVID worse. So it was like a little bizarre.
Like footloose shows.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a little bizarre. I mean, it was cool because, you could try some different, maybe more mellow or jazzier stuff you might not normally do.
Mm-hmm.
But we were just happy to be playing it all at that point. So, it definitely felt good to get back into it, but it really feels good now. I feel like, honestly, it's like just now in the last like 6 months or so, even less, I feel like shows are really popping off, and shows are really like filling up with people getting down the way they used to. And I just got off a jam cruise, and we're just out there like in the jam room, packed house, people hugging, sharing drinks. You know what I mean? I'm like, all right, pandemic's officially over. It's like, it definitely like felt like we're back to the sort of rowdiness we're used to. And
that sounds fantastic.
It was great. It was a great feeling. Yeah.
I mean, groove and funk music, that's not the kind of music that's meant to be taken in, just calmly sitting and keeping your distance. And
yeah, no, I like that kinetic experience. That's when I know I'm doing my job. When I see people dancing and sort of losing themselves in it, that sort of cathartic experience. They're walking out of the venue a different person than they were when they showed up. And it's the same for the musicians. It transforms you. You will like after a long day of travel and then sound check and yada yada, it's like you feel a little beat up or tired, just energetically at a low. But when you get on stage and you start just playing and getting into it and making it a physical endeavor, it just changes your whole being. You walk off stage, you're like, oh wow, I feel way more energized than I did when I showed up. And you feel like you transformed your physical being and your psychological being. It's transformative. And that's like, I know music's different for everybody and there's different experiences, but for me, that's really what I want. It keeps me healthy.
I think, Dave, especially for the drummer, because the drummer is the one that's keeping that rhythm throughout for the audience. And then that energy coming back, keeping the drummer going through maybe a long, tiring set, but just invigorating you to pound it out. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I was talking to, we're on Jam Cruise, and I was talking to Carl Denson, and he was commenting on the Andy Frasco set, and he was saying he was just amazed at how fucking energetic they are, how much they're moving around and I was like, I was talking to one of the guys in the band. I was like, how are you going to keep that up when you're Carl's age? And Carl's like, man, nobody stays healthy when they're older by like moving slow. His whole, comment on it was about just that is the healthiest thing you can do for yourself is, expressing energy when you're playing music and just moving your body, making it a physical thing. And look at him. He's like, 70 something or 70 years old. 60s, late 60s, and he's looking great, so I think there's truth to that for sure.
Definitely. Yeah. I have some of the older drummers that are on as guests, like Earl Young is in his 80s and he's still, whipping that kit, so.
Yeah, I love it. It's inspiring, right?
Yeah, very inspiring.
It's inspiring, yeah.
So Dave, as we're talking about, I've had Joey on the show. So you're the second member of the band. I want to, advocate for viewers and listeners. If they're not familiar with the Motet, definitely go check it out. I was trying to remember how I first discovered the group, and I'm not sure if it was through, just picking up an early album or if, I caught a recording on thearchive.org or, something like that. But I remember it was, 2008 area, somewhere in there. And, ever since then I've been hooked,
Nice.
And, I especially love those recordings that were on there of the Halloween shows,
Oh yeah. That was a big influence for us, those Halloween shows. You probably heard like a Prince or maybe even like Earth, Wind and Fire.
Mm-hmm.
We've run the gamut of great 70s funk acts. It's really a educational experience putting together those shows because we wouldn't just feature an album or a greatest hits kind of thing. We would just run their whole discography and, explore YouTube live versions of all the material we could sort of gather from a certain artist, Prince, or even like Jamiroquai, Tower Power. We probably did a dozen of those shows, and it really informed our approach to songwriting, especially the vocal stuff. But man, it's like when you do that and you're like, all right, we're going to do 2 sets of music of our favorite artist. You go down that rabbit hole. It's crazy how much you learn.
And this was one of them. I'm wearing. You did a Headhunters.
What do you got there?
Headhunters.
What is it? Oh yeah.
Headhunters. Yeah.
See it. Yeah. That was our first one. That was our very first one. Our singer Jans was out on the road with Charlie Hunter, and we were trying to figure out what we're going to do for Halloween because he's going to be gone. And the Fox Theater offered us a date, and we were loving on all that Herbie stuff at that point. And so we were just like, let's do a Headhunters show. We got stage props and had a bunch of sort of jungle, like, props to put around stage, and we all dressed up, and man, it was like such a fun experience. Like I said, we learned so much musically from doing it. We became a better band by doing it. We're like, we have to do this every year. And we did it for probably 14 or 15 years after that.
I have the full list in front of me, so I have that luxury. You named a lot of them I had highlighted, but, also Talking Heads, Sly Stone, Stevie Wonder.
Yep.
And the thing for me is, I'm not into tribute bands, and I don't, get off on just, rote versions, cover tunes that are just real basic and sound as much as they can to the original. Right. I like ones where they're really inhabited and maybe take them a little somewhere else, but that the musicians have enough chops where they can do that and actually get inhabit the groove in the songs, take them somewhere. And I felt you guys did that. So I knew right away, this is a special band.
Yeah. Like, and also the arrangements. I think that's my forte is arrangements. I think a lot of drummers are the same way. Like we really sort of embrace an arrangement of a song and how it affects the energy of the crowd and getting creative with an arrangement so that it becomes something different than the way you may have heard of a song before, so it's really fun to take material from your favorite artist, but then rearrange it in a way that becomes like your own statement. Like you said, like doing a song rote, just the way it sort of, you've heard it before, is like, you know what I mean? Like, what's the point? Mm-hmm. So, I think we spent a lot of time trying to do that with that material, all the P-Funk stuff, figuring out ways to segue song to song and different breakdowns to, expand on a certain portion of the song. It's really fun. I mean, I did that for Jam Cruise this past time. I got hired to run the Super Jam. So I had to put together material for like between 40 and 50 musicians that were already on the boat. It was quite it's quite an endeavor. It was not an easy task. It wasn't like, 40 musicians at the same time. It was like every song had a different lineup, and I had to sort of wrangle all the different musicians for the different lineups and, sort of put all that together, not just musically, but logistically, charts and, set time and rehearsal time and trying to figure out who might be good for what song and that sort of thing. So it was quite a learning experience, but, I try to take those songs and change them up a little bit so that, they really like suited the moment. They suited the players and they suited the sort of, environment they were playing in, whether it was changing the tempo a little bit or switching the key or expanding on a certain area of the song so there could be solos and that sort of thing. But I feel like that's kind of my forte in a lot of ways.
Well, it definitely is highlighted on these sets we're talking about.
Nice.
And also, like you said, going deep in the catalog, pulling out some nuggets that, you don't hear very often. That's like a key also. And, if you're a big fan of that band and you hear that you've pulled that out, it's like, okay, these guys, they're deep into it. They know what they're doing.
Yeah. Especially with YouTube. I mean, it's amazing what you can find on YouTube. I love that, just exploring, and not only a band's, version of their own song, but other people's interpretation too. I just think it's fascinating how you can interpret a song so many different ways. But with P-Funk, it's just endless. There's so many versions of the songs, and you get to sort of kind of get into the psychology of George or the other members of the band when you see different versions of the song sort of following the different players who are in the band at a certain time period, and you kind of get to know the eras of a group. Earth, Wind and Fire, you get to know their eras and what was happening with them in the 80s versus the late 70s versus the early 70s, and seeing all the different players coming and going. It's just it's really fascinating. It becomes like this sort of biography of the band.
Yeah, well, especially with P-Funk, because there's such a huge cast of musicians.
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess two that you didn't do that maybe I would have suggested, and you're not doing them anymore. I don't know if you'll revive it, but if you do, Ohio Players and Isley Brothers.
Oh, dude, I wanted to do the Isley Brothers so bad. We played a show at Cervantes this past January, and I was just pushing and pushing to get us to do the Isley Brothers. It's like my favorite. It's like my happy place listening to their music, and it kind of would have been perfect for us right now because we don't have horn sections, so we could kind of embrace that music a little more because it's it's not about the horns as much as it is about the grooves and the rhythm section. Isley, that's great. The Ohio Players is one that I've definitely thought about, and also the Barkays.
Mm-hmm.
I really think we could do the Barkays justice. People don't know that band. That's the problem. Is I think that some of the guys feel like maybe we've exhausted the bands that people were actually sort of know about in our scene, and that we might not sort of get the excitement from the audience from some of these groups. But I think that part of why we did it in the past was to educate people about the music, and the mere fact that we're doing a tribute to a certain group, I think gets people excited, especially if they don't know the group, because then they're even more like curious, So I think that I would love to do all three of those groups, different times.
Well, yeah, I mean, the Isley Brothers are in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame even. I mean, they're pretty.
Yeah. their repertoire and the expanse of the repertoire, the fact that they wrote Twist and Shout in the 50s, right? And then they watched the Beatles play that song on the Ed Sullivan Show. Now, there was a story of Ernie Isley being a kid watching that with Jimi Hendrix sitting next to him and his older brother on the other side. It's just like, wow, man, these guys have been through it, you know?
Exactly. Yeah.
And
don't quite get the due for that.
yeah, they don't, you know, and they should. Really interesting. I don't know what they were doing in the 70s live. That's one thing that kind of always throws me is like Ernie was playing drums on all those later 70s tracks, you know, which are my favorite Isley Brother tracks.
Yeah.
And he's playing drums. I'm like, how did they record that? You know, did he play guitar to a click? But there, you know, I've checked it out and it's not metronomic. So he must have played drums first and then laid guitar down afterwards.
Yeah, I think probably drums with his brother Marvin on the bass.
But then I can't find any live 70s stuff. So I'm wondering, like, they just didn't even play live, you know, when they started recording those records. But I would love to see what, you know, they sounded like live.
Yeah, I was
At
actually
that
just
point.
thinking about that this week. It's coincidental, actually, that, you know, where's the live footage of the Isley Brothers from the mid and late 70s? You know,
Yeah.
It's like they
Yeah,
were huge, platinum
Right.
albums every time out.
Right.
Where's the footage?
Right. There's none of it's on YouTube. Yeah. Like, it's pretty interesting. Someone needs to pick the brain because they're still doing it. I saw a Tiny Desk concert recently with Ernie and Ronald still doing it, you know, which is just so fucking inspiring, man. Like, that's like 6 decades. Is that right?
At least, right?
Yeah. It's like
50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s. 7th decade, right?
they're on their seventh. Wow. Yeah. I mean, they deserve accolades just for that. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. But back to you guys. So how did you first get into drums? You know, what drove you to them?
Oh, I mean, I'm kind of a black sheep of the family, so it wasn't like I came from a musical upbringing or anything like that. I just, when I was a kid, man, I just loved Kiss. I saw Kiss, you know, all the makeup and Peter Criss with his boots and, you know, just the show. I thought it was the coolest thing ever, you know. I mean, I love the Beatles. I loved music growing up, you know. And I'm not sure what just made me want to be a drummer, except for just seeing drummers and thinking they're the coolest thing ever, you know. And the exposure was different back then, you know, in the 70s. You know, it's not like we had YouTube, you know, or Spotify or anything like that. It was like you listened to the radio and you heard ads for bands, you know, coming to perform somewhere. But you know, the exposure was a different thing, and you kind of had to search it out a lot more. So there's a lot more mystery, I think, behind it at all. It's very like it all seemed very just, I don't know, just mysterious and exciting. So I just like just got turned on by those kind of rock groups. And I just started, you know, studying drums as part of like the school band. Like that was the first time I had a pair of sticks and a snare drum. Practice band was a school band. I didn't get my first kit until I was like 12.
Did you ever get to go see Kiss?
No, never saw Kiss. I saw Toto. That was my first concert when I was probably 13. So it was all the bands that were on the radio. And yeah, there's a lot of good music on the radio back then. You know, it spanned sort of, you know, rock radio spanned genres. I mean, you know, I loved Chic. I loved, you know, I didn't know why I loved it, but you know, I loved Freak Out and Good Times because that was on the radio, and I just loved the sound of that music. So I definitely loved disco music too. Um, and I guess I just loved the groove, so there's part of it was like the look of the rock bands, but part of it was just I loved the groove of drums and the way it felt, especially with that sort of late 70s disco stuff that was on the radio. And that stuff was pervasive, and it was cool because disco at that point still was funky, and it wasn't so clicked out. It wasn't on a grid. It was still funk musicians playing,
That's so mechanical. Yeah.
yeah, the kick wasn't as interesting as it was in the early 70s. You didn't hear the syncopations like you did with Sly and the Family Stone or Earth, Wind and Fire, earlier 70s stuff. But it still was funky, you know what I mean? And it had pocket, and it had the bass lines were super cool. So disco music still had something, creative and funky to say. Later on, I think it got, the 80s things got more square. And that disco got a bad rap. I kind of like took it to heart, and disco got a bad rap. And so I kind of was anti-disco from like once I started playing drums and I started getting more into jazz. And, I felt like that was real music, jazz and jazz fusion. And, I kind of like looked down on disco and even funk music. My buddy would play me P-Funk tracks, and I was like, this is disco. It's not that cool. And I would play him Stanley Clarke and be like, this is funk. And he'd be like, that's jazz fusion. That's not that cool. So there's like, you see that like sort of butting of heads about like, what's cool and not cool in music. Now I realize it's all cool. It's like good music is good music, and it doesn't necessarily have to be a part of a certain genre. But it wasn't until after I sort of got out of Berkeley and started touring with the band that I got more into, reaching back into funk music and realizing like how great that music is and how it can be every bit as creative as fusion, and more something that my sort of fan base at that point would want to hear, sort of getting into the jam scene.
Who would you say are a couple of your most influential drummers for what you do?
Oof. That's such
Let's
a hard question.
limit it to 5.
Such a hard question, man. I mean, there's so many, like I still listen to Tony Allen and just am amazed. And like my most influential drummers aren't necessarily the drummers that I play like, you know what I mean? Like my number one drummer growing up was John Bonham, and to this day, like I've been doing a little Zeppelin tribute recently, and to this day, I'm like, God, the way he played those fills and the way he just played the time, it's unbelievable. Like it's so him, it's so consistently him. It has such a feeling to it, that, and I can't even come close to replicating it. I could just do what I do and, mess around with some of his ideas. But I consider him one of my most influential drummers, yet I don't sound like him at all, Honestly, I would choose to play more like Ernie Isley than I would like, somebody I've listened to a million times, like Dennis Chambers, I would choose to play
Well, I guess there's those that you admire and those that you emulate.
Yeah. Yeah. Like the Barcade, like I tend to stick. I just, for myself personally, I feel like I just sound better when I'm playing simpler and playing like more in the pocket and playing less. So I would sound more like, the drummer for the Barcades than I would for like, Bigfoot, Jerome Braley. So it's like for, emulating and being influenced by, I guess, are different things. But I suppose, you listen to, drummers and they just, it seeps in regardless, especially if you really get into it, like Steve Gadd or Vinny Caliuta. So many great players out there. It's hard to even just narrow it down. But, part of my influence is also just the sound of the drums, not even just the playing, but the sound of the drums. And then there's like modern day influences too, like Sput or Deitch, Nikki Glaspie, all the new players that I get to see live because I play the same festivals, those are the guys that influence me as well because I get to really feel what they're doing with the crowd and the energy of the room and with the musicians they're playing with. Those guys are as much an influence on me as any of the, classic drummers of the 70s.
Do you ever program drum solos into the set, or is it not part of the repertoire?
No, I definitely do solos for sure. I love it. I'd like to do more. I'd like to shed more. It's kind of funny. It's like solos are where you can kind of make a statement where people might be like, oh, that guy's badass. Like you might play the perfect shit for the whole song and it's killer, but and the best thing about it is no one notices you. You know what I mean? Like the greatest drummers, sometimes like people don't notice at all until they take a solo. And then all of a sudden the spotlight's on and people are like, oh, that's a great drummer. So it's kind of like important to do that, I think, just to sort of wake people up like, oh, that's right. There's this badass drummer back there. Alvin Ford's really good at that. Alvin will just say, he'll just be in the pocket the whole set, you know what I mean? And he can do so much more. And then like, he'll get unleashed and just faces will melt,
Yeah.
Really, well, the restraint is, it's great skill.
Similar for the bass guy too, if the bass player doesn't get a solo at some point.
Yeah. Yeah. Right. Yeah. I'm lucky enough to have a bass player who just can crush solos all night. We could give him one every song and he's just as enthusiastic for each one. Yeah.
Now, do you tune your drums?
Yeah. Yeah. It's like, that's actually an important skill when you're touring with backline. We'll do tours where I'm backlining every night, like 7 shows, 7 different drum sets. So really, that puts you in a position to like really have to figure out how to tune the drums to the sound that you want, Part of it's the head and part of it's the kind of drum you're playing. But you just get good at figuring out how to get the sound that you want out of whatever drum you're playing. So when you're backlining every night, that just kind of forces you into that. And then you get good at doing it quickly because you kind of have to,
And what inspired you to start the band and where did the name come from?
Well, I moved to Colorado in the mid 90s and I was kind of freelancing around at that point. When I was in Boston, I had a group that I was writing music for. But when I moved to Boulder in the mid 90s, I spent a couple years just freelancing around and playing jam sessions and putting together groups and doing a lot of acid jazz, doing like some jazz, but more just funk jams and that sort of thing. But eventually I got sick of just playing other people's music, wanted to play my own music. And I like writing music and I like sort of having a vision for how I want, the vibe of an evening to go with music, not just like this song and this song and this song, but trying to create an arc of energy throughout the night and trying to get creative with how the musical experience is. So I decided, decided that I needed to start my own group, and there's so many great players in the area at that point, and even more so now, that I figured I could just call my friends and put together bands and just start my own group. So first was Dave Watts Trio, Dave Watts Quartet, Quintet, Sextet, yada yada. And eventually I just decided to call it the Dave Watts Motet, so I wouldn't have to keep changing the poster. Just keep it that way for however long, and which was about a couple years, and then right before we made our first record, decided to change it to just the Motet.
And what were your aspirations, ultimately? I mean, did you want to become this huge band, or did you want to just kind of be successful enough where it could support you, or did you want to make sure that you could be creative and damn the masses, or what was your mindset?
Yeah, I think damn the masses is a good way to look at it. I definitely didn't have an agenda of sort of success. It was more like, well, I just want to play the music that makes me satisfied. I want to walk off stage and be like, like I said, like a cathartic experience. I want to feel like I'm growing something over time. I want to feel like I have an ability to be creative whenever I want to. If I have 3 or 4 songs on the back burner that I'm working on, when I get home from a tour that I can start to mess around with, then I'm happy. You know what I mean? I feel like I've got something purposeful going on. But if I feel like, I got to learn like all these different songs by all these different artists, for my weekends shows coming up, and I've got to play all these cover tunes, or I've got to play like, at one point I remember I was in like 4 different bands that all had a song called Gravity. I'm like, I can't keep track of this shit, man. It's like, I just want to play my own music. I'm not looking forward to that, So for me, it's like, if I have my own tunes that I'm working on that like I'm inspired to get creative with, and that, sort of like pushes my own creative envelope, then I feel like I'm happy. I got something to wake up for. So there wasn't an agenda of success more than just, I want to be able to make a living, I want to like support my family, tour to a certain degree, and and see where it gets me, and also play with players that I'm inspired by and pushed, by, and like that can that also want to just try and push the envelope with creativity and that sort of thing. So it wasn't a very specific concept, but once you sort of set those wheels in motion, then things fall into place, and then you kind of follow the path. At first I had 2 different percussionists in the group, so we were doing a lot of Afro-Cuban, Afro-Brazilian, West African. We would do drum pieces and rhythm pieces and traditional music of Santeria and that sort of thing. That was early days of Motet. And, and that was just due to the players we had in the band at that point. And so we just went down that path, and, eventually different players need to do different things and split off. And then we would go down a different path and mix it up a little more, and try some different stuff. That's where doing those Halloween shows really, like I said, informed more sort of funk, 70s funk, horn-based sound that we've gotten into.
Was the first album Breathe or Play? Because I see
Breathe.
it. Okay.
Yeah. Breathe was the first one. Play was the second one. But both of those have a lot of that sort of West African, Afro-Cuban sound, and our singer Jans was great at singing in different languages, Lukumi and some of the Nigerian dialects, and Spanish and that sort of thing. So that's the path we took because of the players in the band, and because we were inspiring each other to try this music that we'd never really done before. And it's kind of always been like that, you know. And now our latest record we put out is all instrumental and no horn section, you know. So it's you know, it's something different for us still, and that's what sort of lights a fire for us. It gets us excited and makes us, you know, pushes us to like try different things. You know, I can't imagine ever being in a sort of rut where you're just recreating your own sound, you're imitating yourself, you know.
That can be the curse of having a big hit. You know, you get obligated. Yeah.
Right.
That was definitely the demise of some of the better funk and disco groups from back in the day.
Yeah.
Especially with the label pressure.
Yeah. Right.
Were there any bands that you can point to that were sort of like somewhat templates for what you wanted to do, or were, you know, inspirational in terms of, you know, I kind of like what they're doing, I kind of want to follow a similar path?
Yeah. I mean, I think all the bands in the jam scene that were sort of blowing up, like Galactic and Lettuce, Oregon, Snarky, like when we see these bands that are being uber creative and, you know, becoming popular and finding success, that's really like an inspiration for us. I mean, every genre that we've sort of explored has its own groups that are inspiring. You know, we would play Jazz Aspen and see, you know, a Cuban group like Cubanismo play, and it was just like, wow, that's, you know, you see them live and it's just like mind is blown, and then you're like, okay, we're gonna try some of that. You know what I mean? Like, so there's been so many different groups that are, you know, that are inspirational to us. I think that when we see a band live, this is why I like going to festivals so much. You know, you see a band live and it's just like, oh, and you really feel it. You know what I mean? Especially in our scene, seeing like Ghost Note live, it's just like so inspiring, man. You know, their energy and their arrangements, and, you know, every time I see Sput, it's just blows my mind. You know, or being
I got to get Mono Neon on too. Yeah.
Yeah, get him on, man. I'm sure he's got a lot to say. His dad was the bass player for the Bar-Kays. So he's got that in his family. Being on Jam Cruise, I just saw this group, Simonde. Do you know Simonde? They have a song called Brothers on the Slide. They recorded probably in 1972, maybe.
Oh, yeah, that old band.
Yeah, the old band.
Yeah. They're
still around, and it's like, as far as I could tell, all original members. Like, these guys were older; they were probably in their late 60s, early 70s.
They were doing shows with like Mandrill and stuff back then.
Yes. They're Trinidadian, living in London. Man, they were so good, so good. When you hear a band like that, their pocket and their relaxed feel, and the way they can just own a groove is incredibly inspiring. That was one of those experiences where I listened to the band, you know, went down that rabbit hole before we got on Jam Cruise, just to like really dig into the music, but none of it compared to the live experience. Like, it was
they're an eclectic band, but I'm glad you mentioned them. I'm gonna look into that, knowing that they're still doing stuff.
Still doing
That's
it.
very cool.
They're still doing
very
it.
Cool. You know, I find an interesting phenomenon in that a lot of the best funk or more prominent funk bands now are mostly like white guys. And, you know, I'm not sure how or why that happened, but it seems similar to kind of what happened with blues. But the difference to me is with blues, you had all these blues-based rock bands that blew up in terms of how popular they were and got into the mainstream. But funk, even though it's moved over and been embraced that way, is still kind of under the radar and not blown up like that did. And I'm just wondering why that is, you know?
I don't know. It's crazy to listen to the live recordings of like Earth, Wind, and Fire from a 75. And they're like in an arena You know what I mean? People just going ape shit for their music, and it's just like that. Yeah, I think the 80s did a lot of damage to certain bands, and to certain genres. And yeah, funk music didn't do well with like programmed drums and that sort of thing. And it's such a feel oriented music that it was, and bands like Brand New Heavies and Medeski, Martin and Wood, and those groups were coming out in the 90s, and Jamiroquai. That to me is when funk came back, because you started hearing the organic instruments, you started hearing all the analog stuff coming back, you started hearing the players playing in a way that wasn't quantized. It seems like maybe with the sort of the black influence, that went down hip hop. Hip hop is where the sort of like African American influence went, and then for funk, it's like a lot of younger guys listening to it now, just being like, "Oh, that's what I want to play." And I don't know why it's like divided with black or white, but it seems like in the 70s, it's like there was so much singing going on with the black groups, like that's one of my favorite parts about funk was the vocals. And then, and of course the grooves. But when hip hop came out, and I'm not like trying to diss on, any particular genre, it's just, that's not my cup of tea. So I've never gotten into hip hop. I'm not really into repetitious grooves, and that's what I hear a lot with hip hop. It's just the groove is, 1, 2, 4 bars, and then it's just over and over again, it's just not interesting to me. And then with rap, it's like, I'd rather hear singers, I'd rather hear people 3 or 4 part harmonies going on, you know what I mean? Like that to me is like the beautiful part of music, So it's, for me, it's disappointing that like maybe a lot of artists who would have been, singing and doing that sort of thing, if they're being influenced by hip hop, are less inclined to explore that side of music,
Well, for me, I mean, the playing of bands like you guys and Snarky and Lettuce and a lot of the ones you mentioned is at a level of the masters. I mean, it is authentic in its funk influence. And I'm trying to help open the eyes and ears to some of the maybe, for lack of a better term, old school people who maybe like old school funk, to know that authentic funk is still alive and still being made, and there's still creativity pushing it forward.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, I appreciate that. I'm with you. I hope that it's not like it's like dying out by any means. I think it'll always be there. To what degree you'll hear it, like I said, like you used to hear this music on the radio, pop radio. Now it's like I can't put on the radio, it's like there's no music that interests me at all on the radio, or like when I see the difference between Prince playing the Super Bowl and Rihanna playing the Super Bowl, you know what I mean? Like, it's like, come on, man. It's like, for a musician, the difference, and a performer, it's like, I'm not trying to diss on anybody, but it's just so stark, the difference in musicality, what's happening musically. You know what I mean? It seems like people's interest in music has more to do with like lyrics and a show and a visual aspect than it does all the things that I consider to be music,
Yeah.
Harmony and rhythm, and
I still, despite all that, I still have belief that if people are exposed to the real, that they will begin to understand and gravitate towards it. I think that in a lot of cases, they're just not exposed to it.
Yeah.
Nowadays.
Well, yeah, 100%. Yeah. I mean, we'll go play like a festival that's, based around EDM, and I'll meet some kid who's like, 20 years old. And he's like, I've never seen a band before. You guys are so cool. Like, and they've been going to festivals for like 5 years or whatever, but it's been all EDM, it's been all electronic, and they're just so blown away by people playing instruments, you know. So like, yeah, I feel like when people are exposed to it, when they see it, it's just the difference is stark, and they're just, oh, you know, their minds are opened up. But you know, people, it's choose your own adventure now, you know, with Spotify, YouTube and all that. It's not like you hear what someone tells you you're going to hear like it used to be back in the day, you know.
Well, except for the algorithms that if you're listening
True.
to like today's music, it's just going to keep feeding that.
True. Yeah, I mean, and that's the thing. Yeah, the algorithms and your, you know, your friends or whatever. If you're just an EDM kid that's never, you know, checked out live music, then yeah, it's easy to stay in that bubble, you know. So it's like you're exposed to more music than ever, but it can also be insular, you know. So yeah, I think there's always going to be a place for live music. Sometimes you know, I fear that some of these great musicians are going to learn how to do Ableton and that sort of thing, and not become a, you know, like a legendary musician like they would have 20 years ago, because you know, the influences are different now. So
For me, though, I mean, you know, being a Diet in the Wool funk guy, and seeing how it almost came to a death in the late 80s, early 90s.
yeah,
And there's just so little of it happening. If it wasn't Prince or George Clinton,
yeah,
I mean, carrying the torch. So when this wave came, you know, the festival bands and stuff, I mean, it's such a breath of fresh air and so reassuring, and just,
yeah,
you know, gosh.
yeah. No, it's interesting how the jam scene has a lot to do with that, which I can appreciate, you know, especially having been sort of at the beginnings of all that. Just appreciate that that's the scene that I'm in, and that our audiences love that, you know.
Yeah.
There's much more to this great Truth and Rhythm interview. Just continue on to the next part of the episode. Also, be sure to subscribe to this channel. If you've already done so, please share it with friends. And become a member by joining Truth and Rhythm on Patreon, or consider donating at funkinstuff.net. Thank you very much.